Maya Rodriguez was wiping down tables at the end of her shift when two scrawny children appeared outside the diner's glass door, their pleading eyes fixed on the leftover food on plates. The older boy, about 10 years old, held his younger brother tight, both of them dirty, and clearly hadn't eaten in a long time. Despite the strict rules about not giving away free food and the fact that she could be fired, Maya opened the door and brought them inside. "Are you hungry?" The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face. What could be scarier than losing her job while two children were starving right in front of her? But she had no idea that this small act would completely change her life. And she also didn't expect that the powerful man who would come looking for her the next day would turn out to be the father of those two children. Comment below where you're watching from. I love hearing from all of you amazing people out there. The fluorescent lights of Rosie's diner buzzed overhead like tired wasps as Maya Rodriguez sprayed down the last booth of her double shift. Her feet ached in the worn sneakers that had seen better days 3 months ago, and the smell of grease clung to her uniform like a second skin she couldn't wash off. Outside, Seattle's evening rain painted streaks down the windows, blurring the city lights into watercolor smudges. Maya had been working at this diner for 2 years, pulling double shifts to make ends meet in her tiny studio apartment. The tips weren't great, but they kept the lights on and ramen in her cupboard. She'd learned to stretch every dollar, to smile through exhaustion, and to pretend that this was just temporary. But some days, like today, temporary felt like forever. The bell above the door had stopped ringing hours ago, and now only the soft jazz from the radio kept her company as she stacked chairs on tables. Rick, the night manager, was in his office counting the till, probably already planning how to dock her pay for the coffee pot she'd accidentally cracked earlier. Maya had grown used to his petty tyrannies, the way he looked at her like she was disposable. In his world, waitresses like her were interchangeable parts in a machine that ground people up and spat them out. She'd seen dozens of girls come and go through these doors, each one hoping this job would be their stepping stone to something better. Most left disillusioned. A few, like Maya, stayed because they had no choice. The familiar weight of resignation settled on her shoulders as she reached for the last coffee cup. Movement outside caught her eye, and Maya's hand froze halfway to the table. Two small figures pressed against the glass, their breath fogging the window as they peered inside with desperate hunger. The older boy couldn't have been more than 10, his dark hair matted and his clothes hanging loose on his thin frame. He held a smaller boy close to his side, maybe 6 years old, whose wide eyes tracked every plate of leftover food visible through the window. They weren't begging with words, but their silence spoke volumes. Maya had seen plenty of homeless people pass by the diner, but never children this young, never this alone. Her heart clenched as the older boy's gaze met hers through the glass. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of herself at that age, when her own family had struggled to put food on the table. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. Maya's training told her to ignore them, to follow the rules that Rick had drilled into every employee's head. No handouts, no exceptions, no bleeding hearts. The diner wasn't a charity, he'd say, and Maya couldn't afford to lose this job. Her rent was due in 3 days, and she was already behind on her phone bill. But as she watched the smaller boy lean into his brother's embrace, his shoulders shaking with either cold or hunger or both, Maya felt something stronger than fear take hold. It was the same impulse that had driven her to become a waitress in the first place, the desire to take care of people, to make them feel welcome and fed and safe. She'd forgotten that feeling somewhere between her 100th rude customer and her 1000th aching step. Now it blazed to life again, bright and undeniable. Maya set down her cleaning supplies and walked toward the door. "Are you boys hungry?" she asked, opening the door to let them into the warm diner. The older boy nodded wordlessly, tears tracking through the dirt on his cheeks. Up close, Maya could see they weren't as young as she'd thought. The elder boy had the careful composure of someone forced to grow up too fast, while the younger one clutched a stuffed animal that had seen better days. Neither of them spoke at first, as if kindness was a foreign language they'd forgotten how to understand. Maya guided them to a booth near the back, away from the windows where Rick might spot them. Her hands shook slightly as she filled 2 glasses with chocolate milk, the weight of what she was risking settling over her like lead. But when she saw the way the boy's eyes lit up at the simple gesture, she knew there was no turning back. This moment would define who she was, and Maya Rodriguez chose compassion. The boys devoured the sandwiches Maya brought them with a desperation that made her stomach turn. When was the last time they'd eaten? Where were their parents? The older boy, who introduced himself as Jake, ate with mechanical precision while keeping watch over his little brother Tommy. There was something almost adult in the way Jake cut Tommy's sandwich into smaller pieces, and how he made sure his brother ate first before taking a bite himself. Maya noticed details that didn't quite fit. Jake's worn but expensive-looking watch, the quality of their clothes despite the dirt, the way they both said, "please" and "thank you," with perfect politeness. These weren't street kids who'd been homeless for months. Something recent had happened to them, something that had torn them away from a different kind of life. When she asked where they lived, Jake's expression shuttered closed, and he simply shook his head. Tommy whispered something about being scared to go home, and Jake quickly shushed him. "My name's Maya," she said, sitting across from them in the booth. "What are your last names, boys?" But Jake just looked at her with those 2 old eyes and asked if they could have a little more milk. Maya didn't push. She'd been where they were, maybe not exactly, but close enough to recognize the fear and uncertainty. Instead, she brought them more food, watching as color slowly returned to their pale faces. Tommy started to relax, even managing a shy smile when Maya brought him extra cookies. Jake remained vigilant, but Maya caught him studying her face with an intensity that was almost unsettling. It was as if he was memorizing every detail about her, storing away this moment of kindness like a treasure he could examine later. The clock on the wall ticked toward closing time, and Maya felt a growing dread about having to send them back out into the night. The crash of Rick's office door slamming open shattered the quiet sanctuary Maya had created. "Rodriguez, what the hell is this?" His voice boomed across the empty diner as his heavy footsteps approached their booth. Maya's blood turned to ice as she saw the fury in his eyes, the way his face had gone red with indignation. Rick was a man who took pleasure in exerting what little power he had, and Maya had just handed him the perfect excuse to exercise it. "You know the rules about feeding strays," he growled, his voice dripping with disgust as he looked at Jake and Tommy. The boys shrank back in their seats, and Maya felt a surge of protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. She stood up slowly, placing herself between Rick and the children, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. This was it, the moment that would either destroy her livelihood or define her character. Maya Rodriguez had never been one to back down from bullies. "They're just kids, Rick," Maya said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "They were hungry." Rick's laugh was harsh and ugly, the sound echoing off the diner's walls like breaking glass. He launched into a tirade about rules and regulations, about how Maya was paid to serve paying customers, not to run a soup kitchen for every sob story that wandered in off the street. His words were cruel, designed to humiliate her in front of the boys, to remind her of her place in his small kingdom. But Maya stood her ground, her chin raised and her eyes never leaving his face. She thought about every person who had ever made her feel small, every moment she'd bitten her tongue to keep a job she hated. Not tonight. Not in front of these children who needed to see that someone would fight for them. When Rick threatened to fire her on the spot, Maya simply nodded and said, "Then fire me, but I'm not sorry for feeding hungry kids." The silence that followed was deafening. Rick seemed shocked that Maya had called his bluff, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Jake and Tommy watched the confrontation with wide eyes, and Maya could see Jake's hand moving protectively to Tommy's arm. After what felt like an eternity, Rick muttered something about final warnings and stomped back to his office, leaving Maya shaking but victorious. She turned back to the boys, who were looking at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude that made her throat tight with emotion. "Are you in trouble because of us?" Jake asked quietly, his voice carrying a burden of guilt that no 10-year-old should bear. Maya knelt down beside their booth, reaching out to gently touch his shoulder. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're never trouble for being hungry. Never." It was a promise that came from the deepest part of her heart, a vow that these children mattered, that their needs were worthy of risk and sacrifice. Maya walked the boys to the door as the diner's lights began to dim, her heart heavy with worry about where they would spend the night. She pressed a napkin into Jake's hand with her address and phone number scrawled across it in blue ink. "If you need help, if you need anything at all, you come find me," she told them urgently. "Promise me." Jake nodded solemnly, folding the napkin carefully and tucking it into his jacket pocket like it was made of gold. Tommy hugged her waist suddenly, his small arms squeezing tight, and Maya felt tears prick her eyes as she hugged him back. When they finally disappeared into the rainy Seattle night, Maya stood at the diner's entrance watching until their small figures were swallowed by the darkness. She didn't know their last names, didn't know where they came from or where they were going. But something deep in her bones told her this wasn't goodbye. As she locked up the diner and headed home to her empty apartment, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn toward something she couldn't yet imagine. Maya didn't know that the boy had memorized every detail about her face and would tell someone very important about it. Maya's alarm clock screamed at 6 in the morning, dragging her from dreams filled with worried children and angry managers. Her studio apartment felt smaller than usual in the gray morning light, the walls seeming to press in on her as she calculated how many shifts she'd need to cover her rent. The confrontation with Rick the night before replayed in her mind like a broken record, and she wondered if she'd still have a job when she showed up for her afternoon shift. Her bank account had exactly $47.32. She'd checked it obsessively before falling asleep. The phone bill notice taped to her refrigerator felt like a neon sign advertising her failure to stay afloat in a city that devoured people like her. Maya stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, seeing the exhaustion etched in every line of her 26-year-old face. When had she started looking so worn down, so defeated? The girl who'd moved to Seattle with dreams of something better seemed like a stranger now, someone naive enough to believe that hard work and good intentions were enough to change a life. The coffee maker gurgled to life as Maya tried to summon the energy for another day of smiling at customers who didn't see her as fully human. She'd grown skilled at the performance of pleasantness, at swallowing small humiliations with grace and gratitude. It was a survival mechanism she'd learned early, watching her mother navigate similar service jobs with quiet dignity. But last night, something had shifted inside her. Some fundamental equation between self-preservation and moral courage had been rebalanced. The memory of Jake and Tommy's faces haunted her as she dressed in her uniform, their desperate hunger a reminder that some things mattered more than keeping your head down. Maya grabbed her keys and headed for the door, steeling herself for whatever consequences awaited her at Rosie's diner. She'd made her choice, and she'd live with it, even if it meant scrambling for a new job in a market that chewed up waitresses and spat them out with ruthless efficiency. The morning rush at Rosie's was typical chaos. Coffee-addicted commuters grabbing breakfast sandwiches while checking their phones. Construction workers ordering full plates before heading to job sites that paid them more in a day than Maya made in a week. She moved through the familiar dance of taking orders and delivering food, her body on autopilot while her mind churned with worry. Rick had been giving her pointed looks all morning, his displeasure radiating across the diner like heat waves. Maya knew he was waiting for the perfect moment to assert his authority, to remind her who held the power in their relationship. The lunch crowd was just beginning to filter in when everything changed. The door chimed with the entrance of someone whose presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the room, and Maya looked up to see a man in a suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. Alexander Morgan moved through the diner like he owned it, his steel-gray eyes scanning the room until they locked onto Maya with laser precision. Every conversation seemed to quiet in his wake. Alexander Morgan was not the kind of man who belonged in places like Rosie's diner. At 35, he carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the Seattle drizzle, and his charcoal suit fit him like it had been crafted by angels. But it was his eyes that caught Maya's attention. Cold and calculating. The kind of gray that reminded her of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. When he approached her station, every instinct Maya had developed over 2 years of dealing with difficult customers began screaming warnings. This man was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with power. He moved like a predator who knew exactly what he wanted and exactly how to get it. Maya felt suddenly small in her polyester uniform, conscious of every coffee stain and frayed hem that marked her as beneath his notice. Yet here he was, walking directly toward her with purpose that made her mouth go dry. "Maya Rodriguez," Alexander said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a judgment. It wasn't a question. He knew exactly who she was, which sent ice through her veins because she had no idea who he was or how he'd learned her name. "I need to speak with you privately." His voice carried the kind of authority that made lesser mortals jump to attention. But Maya had spent too many years being ordered around by men who thought their gender or position gave them the right to command her. She glanced around the diner, aware that every customer and co-worker was watching this interaction with undisguised curiosity. Rick had emerged from behind the counter, his expression shifting from territorial anger to something approaching deference as he took in Alexander's expensive appearance. Maya's spine straightened as she realized this man expected her to simply follow him like an obedient dog. The same defiance that had driven her to feed 2 hungry children the night before flared to life again. "I'm working," she said evenly. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested." The smile that crossed Alexander's face was sharp as a blade and twice as cutting. "I'm not selling anything, Miss Rodriguez. I'm here to make you an offer." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the diner's shabby interior with obvious distaste before returning to her face. "I need you to come home with me." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Maya felt every person in the diner suddenly lean forward in their seats. The suggestion was so inappropriate, so presumptuous, that for a moment Maya could only stare at him in shock. Rick was moving toward them now, probably sensing either an opportunity or a threat, and Maya knew she had about 30 seconds before this situation spiraled completely out of control. Alexander Morgan. She'd caught his name when Rick started practically genuflecting, continued watching her with those storm cloud eyes, as if her compliance was a foregone conclusion. The arrogance of it, the casual assumption that she was something he could simply purchase or command, made Maya's blood boil with an anger that surprised her with its intensity. "Excuse me?" Maya's voice cut through the sudden silence of the diner like a knife. She was dimly aware that her hands were shaking, that every customer had abandoned their meals to watch this unfolding drama. Alexander's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she hadn't immediately capitulated to whatever authority he thought he possessed. "I said I need you to come home with me," he repeated, as if the problem was her hearing rather than his shocking presumption. Maya felt heat flooding her cheeks, the familiar sensation of being cornered by someone who held all the cards. But the memory of Jake and Tommy's grateful faces gave her strength, reminding her that some stands were worth taking regardless of the consequences. "Mr. Morgan," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I don't know what kind of establishment you think this is, but—" He held up one perfectly manicured hand, cutting her off with a gesture that spoke of years of having his interruptions respected and obeyed. "Yesterday evening," Alexander said quietly, "my sons Jake and Tommy disappeared from our home. They were missing for 12 hours before I found security footage of them leaving this diner with full stomachs and clean faces." Maya's world tilted sideways as the pieces suddenly clicked into place. The expensive watch, the polite manners, the way Jake had studied her face like he was memorizing it. These weren't random homeless children. They were the sons of one of Seattle's most powerful men. The implications crashed over her in waves. The boys had run away from this man, had been so desperate they'd chosen the streets over their father's house. What kind of home life drove children to such extremes? Alexander continued speaking, his voice carrying undercurrents of barely controlled emotion that made Maya's skin prickle with warning. "My sons told me about the woman who fed them when they were hungry, who protected them from a man who wanted to throw them back onto the streets. They described you in great detail, Miss Rodriguez. Every detail. His eyes never left her face as he spoke, and Maya felt like prey being circled by a predator who was in no hurry to strike. The revelation that Jake and Tommy were Alexander Morgan's children recontextualized everything about the previous night, and Maya struggled to process the new information while maintaining her composure under his intense scrutiny. She'd read about Alexander Morgan in the business section of newspapers left behind by customers. Tech mogul, venture capitalist, the kind of man whose decisions affected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. The disconnect between that public persona and the father whose children had been desperate enough to run away created a cognitive dissonance that made her head spin. Your sons, Maya said slowly, testing the words, were hungry and scared when they came here. What does that tell you about the kind of father you are? The question escaped before she could stop it, and Maya immediately regretted her boldness when Alexander's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering. But she couldn't take it back now, couldn't pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen in those boys' eyes. Rick was hovering nearby, probably torn between defending a customer and protecting his authority over his staff. But Maya ignored him entirely. This conversation was bigger than the diner, bigger than her job, bigger than anything she'd ever been part of. Alexander's jaw tightened at her challenge, and for a moment Maya thought she might have pushed too far. But then something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor of control he wore like a second skin. My sons have been through a difficult time, he said quietly, his voice carrying notes of pain that he was trying desperately to hide. Their mother died 2 years ago in a car accident, and I haven't been the father they needed. They've been acting out, running away, and I've run out of options. The admission seemed to cost him something, and Maya felt her anger shifting towards something more complicated. Grief, she realized. This man was drowning in grief and guilt, and his children were suffering for it. The nanny quit last week, Alexander continued, and my sons refused to accept anyone new. But they talked about you all night, Miss Rodriguez. They said you were kind to them when kindness was the last thing they expected from the world. They said you stood up to someone who wanted to hurt them. His eyes held hers steadily as he delivered his next words like a blow. I need you to be their nanny. Name your price. But when Maya looked into his cold eyes, she knew this wasn't simply a nanny job. Maya stared at her phone for the third time in 10 minutes. Lisa's contact information glowing on the screen like a lifeline. Her best friend since nursing school would either talk her out of this insane decision or give her the push she needed to take the biggest leap of faith in her life. Alexander Morgan's business card sat on her tiny kitchen table next to a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, the embossed letters seeming to mock her hesitation. $75,000 a year to care for 2 boys who had already stolen her heart. It was 10 times what she made at the diner, enough money to pay off her student loans and maybe even save for the future she'd stopped believing in. But the memory of Alexander's cold eyes haunted her. The way he'd looked at her like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. When she finally pressed Lisa's number, her hands were shaking with equal parts terror and anticipation. Some decisions changed everything, and Maya could feel the weight of this one settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Girl, you're calling me at 7 a.m. on my day off, Lisa's sleep-rough voice complained through the phone. This better be good. Maya found herself spilling the entire story. The boys at the diner, the confrontation with their father, the job offer that seemed too good to be true. Lisa listened without interrupting, a skill she'd developed during their years of friendship through Maya's various crises and catastrophes. When Maya finished, silence stretched between them for a long moment before Lisa spoke again, her voice now fully awake and sharp with concern. Maya, honey, this sounds like the setup to either a fairy tale or a horror movie, and I'm not sure which. But as they talked through the pros and cons, as Lisa played devil's advocate and Maya defended her growing certainty, both women knew the decision had already been made. Maya Rodriguez was tired of playing it safe, tired of letting fear make her choices for her. If she was going to crash and burn, at least it would be while reaching for something better. The address Alexander had given her led to a gleaming high-rise in downtown Seattle. The kind of building Maya had only seen from the outside while walking to work. The doorman's uniform probably cost more than her monthly rent, and the lobby's marble floors reflected her nervous face back at her from every angle. Maya felt like an imposter in her best dress, a simple navy blue thing she'd bought for job interviews 3 years ago, as she waited for the elevator to carry her to the penthouse. Her reflection in the polished steel doors showed a young woman trying desperately to look more confident than she felt, and Maya straightened her shoulders as the floors ticked by with mechanical precision. When the doors opened directly into Alexander's apartment, she had to catch her breath. This wasn't just wealth. This was power made manifest in marble and mahogany, in floor-to-ceiling windows that turned Seattle into a personal snow globe. Maya stepped into a world so far removed from her own that she might as well have been boarding a spaceship bound for another planet entirely. Jake and Tommy were waiting in the vast living room, perched on a leather sofa that could have housed a small family. They looked smaller in this opulent space, like 2 small birds lost in a cathedral. When they saw Maya, their faces lit up with a joy that made her throat tight with emotion. Tommy launched himself into her arms with the unself-conscious affection of childhood, while Jake hung back with a shy smile that was somehow more precious for its restraint. "You came back," Tommy whispered against her neck, and Maya realized these children had been abandoned so often that her simple presence felt like a miracle. But even as she hugged them close, Maya noticed the changes in their demeanor from the previous night. They were quieter, more careful, as if the weight of their father's expectations had settled on them like invisible chains. In this palatial home surrounded by every luxury money could buy, Jake and Tommy seemed somehow more lost than they had on the rainy streets. The contrast was heartbreaking and telling in ways Maya was only beginning to understand. Mrs. Crawford materialized from the kitchen like a specter in sensible shoes, her gray hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the disapproval across her features. She was the kind of woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of looking down on people despite being only average height herself, and her pale blue eyes assessed Maya with the enthusiasm usually reserved for finding bugs in one's breakfast cereal. "So you're the new girl," she said, managing to make "girl" sound like an insult worthy of a duel. "Mr. Morgan has explained your arrangement. I've been managing this household for 15 years, and I don't expect that to change because of some temporary situation." Her tone suggested that Maya's presence was both unwelcome and unlikely to last longer than it took to find someone more suitable. The older woman's hostility was so immediate and overwhelming that Maya felt like she'd been slapped. But she forced herself to smile politely while internally cataloging every microaggression. This was going to be more complicated than she'd anticipated. "I'm sure we'll work well together, Mrs. Crawford," Maya replied evenly, refusing to let the woman's attitude rattle her composure. She'd dealt with difficult people her entire life, and she wasn't about to be intimidated by someone whose primary skill seemed to be professional disdain. But Mrs. Crawford wasn't finished establishing the hierarchy, and her next words carried the precision of surgical strikes designed to draw blood without leaving obvious wounds. "The previous nannies found it challenging to adjust to our standards here," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Girls from certain backgrounds often struggle with the expectations of a household like this one. I hope you'll prove more adaptable than the others." The coded language was crystal clear. Maya didn't belong here, wasn't good enough for this world, and would inevitably fail to meet the standards of her betters. It was classism wrapped in politeness, discrimination served with a smile, and Maya felt her temper beginning to simmer beneath her careful facade. But she also noticed Jake watching the exchange with unusual intensity, his young face showing anger that suggested he'd witnessed this performance before. Maya's assigned bedroom was larger than her entire apartment, with its own bathroom and a walk-in closet that could have housed a small family. The decor was impeccable in the way that only money could achieve. Neutral tones, expensive furniture, and artwork that probably cost more than most people's cars. It was beautiful and cold and utterly impersonal, like a luxury hotel room designed to impress rather than comfort. Maya sat on the edge of the king-size bed and tried to process the surreal turn her life had taken in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, she'd been a struggling waitress facing eviction. Tonight she was living in a penthouse and caring for the children of one of Seattle's most powerful men. The financial security was overwhelming in the best possible way, but the emotional complexities were already proving more challenging than she'd anticipated. Crawford's barely concealed hostility was just the beginning, and Maya suspected that woman was only the first of many obstacles she'd face in this rarefied world where money talked and people like Maya were expected to listen. The sound of crying pierced the apartment's expensive silence sometime after midnight, jolting Maya from the uneasy sleep she'd finally managed to achieve. She followed the sound down the hallway to Tommy's room, where the 6-year-old was caught in the grip of a nightmare that had him thrashing against his superhero-themed sheets. His face was flushed with fear and tears, and he was calling for his mommy in a voice that broke Maya's heart into 1,000 pieces. She gathered him into her arms without hesitation, rocking him gently while whispering soothing nonsense until his breathing began to slow. Jake appeared in the doorway like a small ghost, his own sleep clearly disturbed by his brother's distress. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, Maya could see the exhaustion written across his young face, not the temporary tiredness of a long day, but the bone-deep weariness of a child who had been carrying too much responsibility for far too long. These boys were drowning in their own home, and Maya realized with crystal clarity that this job was going to require more than childcare skills. It was going to require her heart. But in the middle of the night, Tommy's crying made her realize something was very wrong in this family. Tommy's nightmares became Maya's introduction to the deeper wounds that festered beneath the Morgan family's polished exterior. Night after night, she found herself padding down the hallway to comfort a little boy whose dreams were haunted by memories too heavy for his young mind to carry. During one particularly difficult episode, as Maya held Tommy while he sobbed about wanting his mama, Jake slipped into the room and curled up beside them on the bed. In the darkness, with his careful composure finally cracking, Jake began to speak about the night that changed everything. His mother had been driving home from a charity event when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into her car. "She died instantly," Jake whispered, but it took the paramedics 40 minutes to cut her free from the wreckage. Their father had been working late that night, as he did most nights, and Jake had been the one to answer the phone when the hospital called. The weight of that responsibility, of being 10 years old and receiving news that would shatter his family, had been crushing him ever since. Maya listened with tears streaming down her own face, understanding finally why these boys carried themselves like survivors of a war zone. "Daddy was different after Mama died," Jake continued, his voice barely above a whisper in the dark room. "He used to laugh and play with us and read bedtime stories. Now he just works all the time, and when he is here, he looks at us like we hurt him somehow." The pain in the child's voice was devastating in its clarity, and Maya began to understand the impossible position Alexander had created for himself. His grief had built walls around his heart that kept even his own children at a distance, and those walls were slowly suffocating the family that remained. Tommy had been 4 when his mother died, too young to fully understand death but old enough to feel the absence like a physical wound. His nightmares weren't just about losing his mother. They were about losing his father to a sorrow so complete it had swallowed the man whole. Maya held both boys close and made promises she wasn't sure she could keep, that they were safe, that they were loved, that someone would fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if Alexander Morgan was too broken to find his way back to the father these children desperately needed. Maya's understanding of Alexander's isolation deepened when she began preparing dinner for the boys, a simple ritual that revealed the depth of dysfunction in their household. Mrs. Crawford had informed her coolly that Mr. Morgan prefers to dine alone in his study, and that the children usually ate whatever the housekeeper prepared for them in the kitchen. The idea of a family eating separately in their own home struck Maya as fundamentally wrong, so she set the dining room table for 4 and prepared a meal that would be ready when Alexander returned from work. When he finally arrived home at nearly 9 p.m., exhausted and still carrying the weight of his business day, he stopped short at the sight of the set table and the warm light spilling from the dining room. For a moment, his carefully constructed mask slipped, and Maya saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression before he shuddered it away. "This isn't necessary," he said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. Maya simply smiled and told him dinner would be ready in 10 minutes, then went to collect the boys who had been watching their father's reaction with hopeful eyes. The dinner that followed was awkward and stilted, but it was also the first time the Morgan family had shared a meal together in months. Alexander sat stiffly at the head of the table, making polite conversation that felt more like a business meeting than family time. But Maya noticed the way his eyes softened when Tommy told him about the book they'd been reading, how he actually smiled when Jake showed him a drawing he'd made that afternoon. These moments of connection were brief and fragile, like soap bubbles that burst at the slightest touch, but they proved that the man Alexander had been wasn't completely lost to grief. Maya found herself studying his face across the table, seeing past the expensive suit and controlled demeanor to the father who was drowning in his own home. When Tommy asked if Daddy would tuck him in, the silence that followed was electric with possibility. Alexander's struggle was visible as he weighed his protective distance against his son's simple request. When he finally nodded and rose from his chair, Maya felt something shift in the family's dynamic, a hairline crack in the walls that might eventually become a door. Saturday morning brought an unexpected gift when Alexander announced that he would be working from home and asked if Maya had any plans for the boys. She suggested a trip to the nearby park, thinking it would be good for Jake and Tommy to burn off some energy in the fresh air. What she didn't expect was for Alexander to look up from his laptop and ask if he could join them. The surprise on his children's faces was heartbreaking. When had spending time with their father become so unusual that it shocked them into silence? Maya watched Alexander struggle with the decision for several long moments, as if the simple act of going to a park with his sons required more courage than closing million-dollar business deals. But something in Tommy's eager expression must have decided him, because he closed the laptop and said he could use some fresh air himself. The walk to the park was stilted at first, with Alexander looking like a man attending his own execution. But gradually, something began to loosen in his posture as Tommy slipped his small hand into his father's larger one. The park transformed Alexander in ways that surprised Maya with their intensity. Away from the corporate environment where he wielded his authority like armor, he seemed younger and more uncertain, like a man remembering how to be human rather than just successful. When Tommy begged him to push the swing, Alexander's initial hesitation gave way to something approaching joy as his son's laughter filled the air. Jake was more cautious in his approach to his father, but Maya noticed how he stayed close, as if afraid this moment of normalcy might evaporate if he looked away too long. For 20 minutes, they were just a family at a park on a Saturday morning, and Maya felt privileged to witness Alexander's transformation from distant CEO to engaged father. But she also noticed how quickly his defenses snapped back into place when other parents began to recognize him, how his spine straightened and his expression became remote again. The weight of his public persona was clearly exhausting, and Maya began to understand why he'd retreated so far into himself after losing his wife. That evening, as Maya was putting the boys to bed, Alexander appeared in the doorway of Tommy's room with a hesitancy that spoke of long absence from this ritual. "Would you like me to read the story tonight?" he asked, and the hope that blazed in both children's faces was almost too bright to look at directly. Maya stepped back to give him space, but Alexander caught her arm gently and asked her to stay. What followed was a scene of such tender domesticity that Maya had to blink back tears, Alexander's deep voice bringing characters to life. Tommy curled against his father's side, Jake listening with rapt attention from his own bed nearby. When the story ended and both boys had been kissed goodnight, Alexander walked Maya to her room with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for reminding me who I used to be." The vulnerability in his admission hit Maya like a physical force, and she felt something dangerous stirring in her chest as she looked into his gray eyes, and saw not the cold businessman but the grieving father trying to find his way home. As they stood in the hallway outside her bedroom door, Alexander's professional mask had completely fallen away, leaving behind a man who looked as lost as his sons had that night at the diner. "I want to ask you to sign a longer-term contract," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The boys have been happier in the past week than they have in 2 years. I don't want to disrupt that stability. Maya nodded her agreement, understanding that this was about more than employment. It was about hope, about the possibility that this broken family might find a way to heal together. But as Alexander's hand briefly touched hers in thanks, Maya felt the dangerous flutter of attraction that she'd been trying to ignore since the moment he'd walked into the diner. He was her employer, the father of the children she'd come to love, and a man so far above her social station that even thinking about him romantically was a form of self-destruction. Yet standing there in the dim hallway, with the sounds of his children sleeping peacefully nearby, Maya allowed herself one moment to imagine what it might feel like to be part of this family, not as an employee, but as something more. But Maya didn't know Mrs. Crawford had made a phone call, and that call would destroy everything she was building. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Lisa as she prepared breakfast for the boys, the message containing a link that made her blood run cold.
"Girl, is this you?"
The tabloid website loaded slowly on her phone screen, but when the image appeared, Maya's world tilted sideways. There she was in full color, walking through the park with Alexander and the boys, looking for all the world like a family enjoying their Saturday morning together. The headline blazed across the screen in bold letters: Tech mogul Alexander Morgan's new gold digger, from diner to designer life in 1 week. The article was vicious in its assumptions, painting Maya as a calculating opportunist who had seduced her way into Alexander's life through his vulnerable children. It detailed her background with surgical precision, her financial struggles, her job at the diner, even her student loan debt, as if poverty itself was evidence of criminal intent. The comments section was filled with speculation about her motives and graphic descriptions of what she'd probably done to secure her position in Alexander's household. Maya's hands shook as she read strangers debating her character and morals, reducing her to a caricature of feminine manipulation and greed. The sound of Alexander's footsteps on the hardwood floors sent panic shooting through Maya's nervous system. She quickly closed her phone, but not before Jake caught sight of her stricken expression and moved closer with the intuitive worry of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions for his own survival. "What's wrong, Maya?" he asked quietly, and she struggled to compose herself while Alexander entered the kitchen looking like he'd already seen the article. His face was a mask of cold fury that reminded Maya why he was feared in boardrooms across the country, but the anger wasn't directed at her. It was radiating outward like heat from a nuclear reactor, threatening to incinerate anyone who dared to attack his family's privacy. "We need to talk," he said tersely, his voice carrying undertones that made Maya's stomach clench with dread. Tommy looked between the adults with growing confusion, sensing the tension but unable to understand its source, and Maya's heart broke for these children who were about to be thrust into a media circus through no fault of their own. Mrs. Crawford appeared as if summoned by the chaos, her face carefully arranged in an expression of concern that didn't quite hide the satisfaction gleaming in her pale eyes. "Such a terrible situation," she murmured, but there was something in her tone that set Maya's teeth on edge. "I do hope this won't reflect poorly on the children. They've been through so much already." The sympathy was false as fool's gold, and Maya felt a sudden certainty that Mrs. Crawford knew more about this situation than she was letting on. But before she could process that suspicion fully, the morning exploded into fragments as Alexander's phone began ringing with calls from his publicity team, his lawyers, and God knew who else. The carefully constructed sanctuary Maya had helped build over the past weeks was crumbling in real time, and she watched helplessly as Alexander's walls slammed back into place with devastating finality. The tender father who'd read bedtime stories just days before disappeared behind the armor of corporate damage control, and Maya felt the distance opening between them like a chasm too wide to bridge. The boys were whisked away to school with extra security, while Maya found herself alone in the penthouse with Alexander's rising fury and Mrs. Crawford's suspicious helpfulness. But it was the arrival of Victoria Morgan, Alexander's mother, that transformed the morning from crisis to catastrophe. She swept into the apartment like a force of nature, dressed in designer clothes and dripping with the kind of authority that comes from generations of inherited power. Victoria Morgan was everything Maya had expected and worse. A woman whose wealth and social position had insulated her from consequences for so long that cruelty had become her default setting. Her assessment of Maya was swift and brutal, her blue eyes cataloging every perceived flaw with the precision of a diamond appraiser finding flaws in a fake stone. "So you're the little waitress who's been playing house with my son," she said, her voice carrying the aristocratic chill of old money and older prejudices. Maya felt the full weight of Victoria's disdain settling over her like a suffocating blanket. But she straightened her spine and met the older woman's gaze without flinching. What followed was a masterclass in sophisticated cruelty as Victoria laid out exactly what she thought of Maya's presence in her son's life. The older woman never used explicitly racist language, but her meaning was crystal clear in every carefully chosen word and calculated pause. She spoke of inappropriate attachments and unsuitable influences, while offering Maya a check with enough zeros to pay off her student loans twice over if she would simply disappear from their lives. The offer was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had such an offer refused, and Victoria's shock when Maya tore the check in half was almost worth the devastating consequences that followed. "You little gold digger," Victoria hissed, her mask finally slipping to reveal the venom beneath. "Do you really think my son would ever seriously consider someone like you? You're a temporary amusement, nothing more." The words hit Maya like physical blows, but what hurt worse was the kernel of truth they contained. What was she to Alexander really, except an employee who'd let herself dream impossible dreams? Alexander's return to the apartment felt like the arrival of an Arctic storm. His expression so cold that Maya actually shivered when he looked at her. His mother had clearly spent their time apart, poisoning whatever small trust they'd built together. And the man who faced Maya now was a stranger wearing Alexander's face. "Did you know about the photographers?" he asked without preamble, his voice cutting through her heart like a blade. The question was so unexpected, so completely opposite to the conversation she'd been prepared to have, that Maya could only stare at him in shock. "Did you tip them off about our trip to the park? About your touching story of helping my sons at the diner?" Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound, and Maya felt her world crashing down around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. The accusation was so outrageous, so fundamentally contrary to everything she was, that she couldn't even formulate a defense. How could he believe she would exploit his children's trauma for personal gain? How could the man who'd held her hand in gratitude now look at her like she was something diseased? The fight that followed was devastating in its completeness, with Alexander's grief and guilt transforming into a weapon aimed directly at Maya's heart. He accused her of orchestrating everything from the beginning, of using his children's vulnerability to manipulate her way into his life and his bank account. Victoria stood nearby like a satisfied cat watching mice destroy each other, occasionally adding fuel to the fire with well-placed comments about Maya's obvious motives and Alexander's naive blindness to manipulation. Maya tried to defend herself, to make Alexander see reason, but every word she spoke seemed to confirm his suspicions and his twisted logic. When she mentioned the check his mother had offered her, Alexander's face went completely white with rage, and Maya knew with sinking certainty that Victoria had somehow twisted even that act of defiance into evidence of her guilt. The man she'd fallen in love with, and Maya could no longer deny that's what had happened, was determined to destroy her to protect himself from the possibility of being hurt again. Maya's hands shook as she packed her few belongings, while Tommy's heart-wrenching sobs echoed through the apartment from wherever Mrs. Crawford had taken the boys. The sound was like a knife twisting in her chest, and Maya had to grip the edge of her dresser to keep from collapsing under the weight of what she was losing. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching her pack with an expression carved from granite. But Maya thought she saw something flickering behind his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or regret. But it was too late for second thoughts or apologies. The damage was done, the trust was shattered, and Maya's fairy tale had revealed itself to be just another story of a poor girl who'd reached too high and fallen too hard. She folded her uniform carefully and placed it on the bed like a flag of surrender, then walked past Alexander without another word because anything she might say would only make the pain worse for all of them. The elevator doors closed on the sound of Tommy calling her name, and Maya felt something essential break inside her chest that she wasn't sure would ever heal. But as she stepped out of the building, Jake ran after her and whispered something that made Maya's blood freeze. "Maya, I know who took those pictures." Rosie's diner felt like returning to a tomb after living in paradise, its fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving after the warm elegance of Alexander's penthouse. Rick's smug satisfaction at Maya's return was obvious in every pointed comment about people who got above themselves and came crawling back where they belonged. He'd taken her back grudgingly, making it clear that her position was even more precarious than before, and that any hint of the attitude she'd shown during their last encounter would result in immediate termination. Maya moved through her shifts like a ghost, mechanically taking orders and delivering food while her mind remained trapped in memories of Jake's bedtime stories and Tommy's sleepy hugs. The customers blurred together into a parade of demands and complaints that barely registered through the fog of her depression. She'd lost more than a job. She'd lost a family she'd fallen in love with, and the grief was so overwhelming that some days she could barely function. Lisa tried to comfort her with ice cream and wine and furious rants about the unfairness of the situation. But nothing could fill the hollow space where hope used to live. Jake Morgan sat in his father's study with the determination of a 10-year-old who decided that adults could no longer be trusted to fix the problems they'd created. He'd been conducting his own investigation since Maya's departure 3 days ago, using his father's computer when Alexander was at work and piecing together clues with the methodical precision of someone much older. What he discovered made his stomach sick with anger and betrayal. Mrs. Crawford's phone records, which he'd found by watching her enter her password one afternoon, showed calls to his grandmother Victoria on the same day the photographers had appeared at the park. Text messages between them revealed the entire conspiracy. Victoria had hired a private investigator to follow Maya, had arranged for the paparazzi to be at the park, and had orchestrated the entire scandal to drive Maya away from their family. Crawford had been reporting on Maya's every move, painting her as a gold digger while secretly working to destroy the happiness that had been slowly returning to their broken home. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that Jake felt physically ill as he printed out the evidence that would clear Maya's name. But when Jake presented his findings to his father, Alexander's response was not what the boy had hoped for. Instead of immediate action and apologies, his father seemed to retreat further into himself, as if learning the truth was somehow more painful than living with the lie. "It doesn't change anything," Alexander said quietly, not looking at the evidence spread across his desk. "Even if Maya didn't orchestrate this, the media attention, the scandal, it's not fair to any of you to live under that kind of scrutiny." Jake stared at his father with growing horror as he realized Alexander was using the conspiracy as an excuse to avoid facing his own feelings, his own fear of being vulnerable again. The man was so terrified of being hurt that he was willing to sacrifice everyone's happiness to protect himself. And Jake felt a rage that was far too old for his years. "You're just scared," he accused, his young voice cracking with emotion. "You're scared to love Maya because then you might lose her like you lost Mom, so you're pushing her away first." The truth of his son's words hit Alexander like a physical blow, but instead of spurring him to action, it only made him retreat further into his protective isolation. Tommy's hunger strike began on the 4th day after Maya's departure. His small act of rebellion, the only power he possessed in a world where adults made decisions that shattered children's hearts without explanation. He refused breakfast, lunch, and dinner, turning his face away from Mrs. Crawford's increasingly frustrated attempts to feed him. "I want Maya," was all he would say, the 3 words becoming his mantra of resistance. Jake tried to comfort his little brother, but Tommy's grief was too profound for simple consolation. The 6-year-old had already lost one mother. Having the woman who'd begun to fill that hole ripped away without explanation was a trauma his young mind couldn't process. Alexander watched his son waste away with growing desperation, but his pride and fear kept him from taking the obvious action that could fix everything. By the end of the week, Tommy had lost enough weight that Alexander finally began to crack, the sight of his dying son forcing him to confront the consequences of his cowardice. But even then, he hesitated. paralyzed by the possibility that Maya might reject his apology after the way he'd treated her. Maya's own decline was less visible, but no less devastating. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her already slender frame becoming almost skeletal as grief killed her appetite and turned food to ash in her mouth. Sleep eluded her despite the exhaustion that seemed to seep into her very bones, and when she did manage to doze, her dreams were filled with the sound of Tommy's laughter and the memory of Alexander's rare smiles. Lisa found her collapsed in her apartment on Friday evening, running a fever and so dehydrated that she had to be helped to the couch like an invalid.
This is insane,
Lisa raged, forcing Maya to drink water and threatening to call an ambulance if she didn't start taking care of herself. You're dying over some rich man who threw you away the first time things got complicated. Where's your self-respect? Where's your fight? The words stung because they contained truth, and Maya felt the first spark of anger she'd experienced since leaving the penthouse. She was Maya Rodriguez, the woman who'd stood up to Rick to feed hungry children, who'd torn up a check rather than accept charity from a bigot. When had she become this broken creature who let other people's choices determine her worth? Lisa's tough love continued through the weekend as she forced Maya to eat, shower, and rejoin the world of the living. You want to waste away over some man? Fine, but first you're going to fight for your reputation. You're going to sue that old witch and her son for defamation, and you're going to make them print a retraction that clears your name. The idea seemed impossible at first. How could someone like Maya take on the Morgan family's army of lawyers? But Lisa had already researched legal aid options and found a young attorney named David Chen, who specialized in cases involving media manipulation and had a particular hatred for wealthy families who thought they could destroy people without consequences. The first consultation was terrifying, but David's quiet confidence and genuine outrage at Maya's treatment gave her the first hope she'd felt in weeks. Maybe she couldn't win Alexander back. Maybe she'd never see Jake and Tommy again, but she could fight for her dignity and her future. The Maya Rodriguez who'd walked out of that penthouse might have been broken, but the woman who walked into David Chen's office was ready for war. But what Maya didn't know was that Alexander had begun his own investigation, and the truth he uncovered was worse than his worst fears. Alexander's hands trembled as he stared at the evidence spread across his desk like the ruins of everything he'd believed. Security footage from the building showed Mrs. Crawford meeting with his mother in the lobby 3 weeks before the scandal broke. Phone records revealed dozens of calls between them, plotting Maya's destruction with the methodical precision of a military campaign. Text messages laid out their strategy in black and white. How Victoria would provide the money for photographers. How Mrs. Crawford would ensure they knew exactly when and where to find Alexander with Maya and the boys. The conspiracy was so thorough, so calculated in its cruelty, that Alexander felt physically sick as he absorbed the magnitude of what they'd done. These women had destroyed an innocent person's life to satisfy Victoria's prejudices and Mrs. Crawford's jealousy, and Alexander had been their willing weapon. The shame was so overwhelming that he had to leave his office and stumble to the bathroom, where he dry-heaved over the sink while his reflection stared back at him with accusing eyes. He'd failed Maya, failed his children, and failed himself so completely that he wasn't sure redemption was possible. The confrontation with Mrs. Crawford was swift and brutal, her composure cracking like cheap paint under the heat of Alexander's fury. When faced with the evidence of her betrayal, she abandoned all pretense of innocence and revealed the depth of her contempt for Maya with startling honesty. She was nothing but a gold-digging little tramp who wormed her way into your bed through your children, Mrs. Crawford spat, her professional mask finally sliding away to reveal the bigotry beneath. Someone had to protect this family's reputation, since you were too blinded by your little brown plaything to see what she really was. The racial slur hit Alexander like a physical blow, and he realized that Maya had been fighting battles he'd been too privileged to even recognize. Mrs. Crawford was fired immediately, escorted from the building by security while she screamed about lawsuits and ungrateful employers. But the damage she'd helped orchestrate couldn't be undone with simple termination. Alexander sat in his empty apartment afterward, surrounded by the silence his choices had created, and tried to figure out how to begin making amends for the unforgivable. Meanwhile, Maya was discovering her own capacity for righteous anger as she sat across from David Chen in his cramped legal aid office, planning her counterattack against the forces that had tried to destroy her. David had found not only evidence of the media manipulation, but also a pattern of similar attacks Victoria Morgan had orchestrated against other women who'd gotten too close to her precious family. "She's done this before," David explained, spreading out documentation of 3 other cases where Victoria had used private investigators and tabloid contacts to destroy women she deemed unsuitable for her social circle. "We have enough evidence to prove conspiracy, defamation, and probably witness tampering. The question is whether you're prepared for the kind of fight this is going to be. The Morgans have resources we can't match, and they'll try to bury us in paperwork and delays." Maya thought of Tommy's tears and Jake's desperate attempt to save his family, of Alexander's coldness and Victoria's casual cruelty, and felt her spine straighten with resolve. She'd been poor before, had struggled and survived, and rebuilt herself from nothing. These people had taken her dignity and her happiness, but they hadn't broken her spirit. "Let them try," Maya said quietly. "I'm done being afraid." Alexander found Maya at the diner during the lunch rush, his appearance causing the same stir it had weeks ago, but for different reasons now. The media attention had died down somewhat, but Alexander Morgan seeking out the woman he'd publicly humiliated was still news worth noting. Maya saw him enter and felt her heart jump traitorously in her chest before she ruthlessly suppressed the reaction. She'd spent too many nights crying over this man to let him waltz back into her life without explanation, and the armor she'd built around her heart wasn't coming down easily. When he approached her station, she continued wiping down tables without acknowledging his presence, a small act of defiance that felt enormous after weeks of feeling powerless. "Maya," he said quietly, her name in his voice still carrying the power to make her hands shake. "I need to talk to you, please." The please was what made her finally look up, because Alexander Morgan didn't plead with anyone, and the man standing before her looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. But looking didn't mean forgiving, and Maya's response was carefully neutral. "I'm working. You'll have to wait until my break." The conversation that followed in the diner's back alley was halting and painful, with Alexander struggling to find words adequate for the magnitude of his failure, while Maya held herself rigidly apart from the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. He laid out the evidence of his mother's conspiracy with clinical precision, his voice breaking only when he described Tommy's hunger strike and Jake's desperate attempts to fix what the adults had broken. Maya listened in silence, her face giving away nothing of the turmoil beneath as Alexander explained how his fear had made him complicit in her destruction. "I thought if I pushed you away first, it would hurt less than losing you later," he admitted, the words barely above a whisper. "But I was wrong about everything. About you, about what you meant to my family, about what I was willing to risk for happiness." The apology was everything Maya had dreamed of hearing, but it came too late and cost too much for her to simply accept. When Alexander finished speaking, Maya took a deep breath and delivered her own devastating truth. "You destroyed me because it was easier than trusting me. That's not love, Alexander, that's cowardice." Maya's response to Alexander's apology was measured and firm, her voice steady despite the emotional chaos threatening to consume her from within. "I appreciate you telling me the truth," she said carefully. "But an apology doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't give me back the reputation your family destroyed, or the job I loved, or the children I came to think of as my own." Alexander flinched at her words, but Maya continued with the strength she'd found in her darkest moments. "You chose to believe the worst of me without giving me a chance to defend myself. You let your mother and Mrs. Crawford manipulate you because it was easier than facing your own feelings. And then you threw me away like garbage when things got complicated." Each statement was a surgical strike aimed at the heart of his failures, and Maya watched Alexander absorb them like physical blows. But when he asked what he could do to make things right, Maya surprised herself with her answer. "Nothing. This conversation is for my closure, not your redemption. I forgive you for my own peace of mind, but I don't trust you, and I won't be coming back." It was the hardest thing she'd ever said, but also the most necessary. Maya Rodriguez was done being anyone's victim, even her own. But Victoria Morgan wasn't finished, and her final attack would target what Maya loved most: the children. Victoria Morgan's final gambit was as vicious as it was unexpected. A custody suit claiming that Alexander was an unfit father who had exposed his children to inappropriate influences and dangerous media attention. The legal papers were delivered to Alexander's office on a Tuesday morning, and the language was designed to wound as much as win. Accusations of emotional neglect, inappropriate relationships with household staff, and failure to provide a stable environment for traumatized children. Victoria's lawyers had done their research, building a case around Alexander's admissions of working too much, his children's behavioral problems, and the recent media scandal involving Maya. The timing was perfect from a strategic standpoint, filing while Alexander was still reeling from the revelation of his mother's conspiracy and before he could mount an effective defense. Victoria's endgame had always been control of her son's life, control of her grandson's upbringing, and control of the family narrative that painted her as the responsible adult cleaning up Alexander's messes. She would not be denied by some waitress who'd gotten above her station or by a son who'd forgotten the importance of maintaining proper social boundaries. The custody hearing became a battleground where Maya's character would determine the fate of the boys she'd come to love as her own. Alexander's lawyers had contacted David Chen with an unusual request. Would Maya be willing to testify on Alexander's behalf about his growth as a father and his fitness to raise his children? The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the woman Alexander had accused of exploitation was now his family's best hope for staying together. Maya's first instinct was to refuse, to let Alexander face the consequences of his choices without her help. But the thought of Jake and Tommy being raised by Victoria Morgan was unbearable. During their prep sessions, David helped Maya understand that her testimony could be more than just character witness. It could be the evidence that exposed Victoria's true motives and methods. "She destroyed you to get to them," David explained. "Your willingness to stand up for them despite what they did to you proves everything about your character and theirs." Maya agreed to testify not for Alexander's sake, but because those children deserved better than being weapons in their grandmother's war for control. Maya's day in court was the most terrifying experience of her life, facing down Victoria Morgan's expensive legal team while representing everything they claimed was wrong with Alexander's judgment. She wore her best dress and held her head high as she took the oath, very aware that she was probably the only person in the courtroom who'd ever worried about making rent or choosing between groceries and gas. Victoria's lawyer tried to paint her as a gold digger who'd manipulated vulnerable children for personal gain, but Maya's quiet dignity and detailed knowledge of the boys' needs, fears, and dreams told a different story. When asked why she was testifying for a man who'd treated her so badly, Maya's answer was simple: "Because Jake and Tommy deserve to stay with their father. They've lost enough already." Her testimony about Alexander's transformation from distant workaholic to engaged parent was devastating in its honesty. She didn't minimize his failures, but showed how he'd grown, how he'd fought his own demons to become the father his children needed. By the time Maya finished speaking, even Victoria's lawyers looked shaken by the obvious love and sacrifice evident in every word. Jake and Tommy's own voices became the deciding factor when the judge allowed them to speak privately about their preferences. Jake, with the wisdom forced on him by trauma and loss, articulated clearly why he wanted to stay with his father despite their difficulties. "My dad is learning how to be happy again," he told the judge with heartbreaking maturity. "Grandma Victoria just wants us to be perfect all the time, like dolls in her house. But Maya taught us that families are supposed to help each other, not hurt each other. Dad learned that too, but Grandma never did." Tommy's contribution was simpler but no less powerful. He drew a picture of his family that included Maya, his father, and his brother, all holding hands in front of their apartment building. When asked to explain the drawing, Tommy said quietly, "This is when we were happy. I want to be happy again." The judge's decision was swift after that, granting full custody to Alexander and issuing a restraining order against Victoria's further interference. But more importantly, the proceedings had exposed Victoria's conspiracy to the public record, vindicating Maya's reputation and creating a foundation for the defamation suit that would eventually bankrupt Victoria's credibility, if not her bank account. The weeks following the custody hearing brought a flood of media attention that finally told Maya's side of the story, transforming her from gold digger to hero in the public narrative. Talk shows wanted interviews, magazine editors wanted profiles, and suddenly Maya Rodriguez was famous for all the right reasons: her kindness, her strength, her refusal to be broken by forces beyond her control. But the attention that meant the most came from unexpected sources. Letters from other women who'd been targeted by wealthy families, job offers from progressive organizations who valued her integrity, and scholarship opportunities to finish her interrupted education. Maya had become a symbol of resistance against classism and racism, though she'd never sought that role. More importantly, she'd proven to herself that she could survive losing everything and rebuild on her own terms. The woman who emerged from the wreckage was stronger, wiser, and absolutely certain of her own worth regardless of what others thought or did to her. Alexander's approach to Maya after the custody victory was different this time: humble instead of demanding, patient instead of presumptuous. He came to the diner every day for a week, ordering coffee and leaving generous tips without trying to force conversation. On the 8th day, he brought Jake and Tommy with him, and Maya's professional composure finally cracked at the sight of the boys she'd missed so desperately. Tommy launched himself into her arms with the uncomplicated joy of childhood, while Jake hung back with that careful smile that meant everything to Maya. "We missed you," Jake said simply, and Maya had to blink back tears as she hugged them both close. Alexander watched the reunion with something like wonder, as if he was seeing his family clearly for the first time in months. When Maya finally looked at him over the boys' heads, she saw not the cold businessman or the wounded widower, but simply a man who'd learned that love was worth the risk of loss. "I know I don't deserve another chance," he said quietly, "but if you're willing, I'd like to try building something real this time. Not an employer and employee, not a fairy tale, but a partnership between equals who choose each other every day." It was exactly what Maya hadn't dared to hope for, and exactly what she needed to hear. The dinner that brought them together as a family happened not in Alexander's penthouse, but in Maya's tiny apartment, where Tommy helped set the table and Jake supervised the cooking with serious concentration. Alexander looked completely out of place in the cramped space, but also more relaxed than Maya had ever seen him, as if he'd finally stopped trying to control every variable and accepted that the best things in life were often messy and unpredictable. They talked about everything and nothing: school, work, dreams, fears, while sharing a simple meal that somehow tasted better than any expensive restaurant could provide. When Alexander asked Maya to consider being more than the boys' nanny, to think about being their family in every sense of the word, her answer came from a heart that had learned the difference between settling and choosing. "I'm not interested in being rescued," she said clearly, "but I'm very interested in building a life with people who see me as an equal partner. If that's what you're offering, then yes." And when Tommy looked up from his plate and called her mom for the first time, Maya knew she'd found exactly where she belonged. And when Tommy called Maya mom for the first time, she knew she'd truly found her place in the world.